A woman is startled when a frozen lynx with 3 cubs asks to enter the house. This occurred as a result of the fierce winter winds that painted the landscape as they roared across the Rocky Mountains. Emily Carter stood at the window of her wooden home in endless colors of white, observing as another blizzard threatened to destroy all traces of the world outside her tiny haven. The loneliness that earlier appeared to be a haven, but now hung over her like a thick cloak, reminding her of the decision she'd made 3 years ago to abandon her work as a wildlife researcher. If you find this article fascinating, please remember to like and subscribe to our channel. Tell us which city you're viewing. Her daily schedule has become as predictable as the mountain for us from Stay Tuned. Before dawn, check the firewood stocks, and keep an eye on the observation, the local fauna, and recording her findings in the old field journal that had grown to be her best friend. The simplicity of her life had brought her a peace that the academic community was never able to provide, despite the fact that the stillness occasionally pressed in too tightly. Emily's minimalist lifestyle was mirrored in the cabin's interior, which had a tiny workstation. Filled with field notes and research papers, walls with intricate drawings of the local fauna, and shelves surrounded by worn-out animal behavior books, the gentle brightness of her solar shadows were thrown by a powered bulb on her most recent journal entry, in which she had been recording the exceptionally harsh weather patterns impacting the environment of the mountain when night fell. As Emily got ready for yet another peaceful evening of study and contemplation, the temperature outside had plummeted to record-low temperatures, and despite her well-insulated cabin, she drew her heavy wool sweater closer, thankful for the warmth despite the severe cold. 3 years of isolation had heightened her awareness of the wood stove at the center of her small house. She was familiar with the rhythms of the mountains, every wind pattern, and the sound of every branch creaking beneath the snow. Swept across the valley, the wilderness had turned into her instructor, demonstrating to her a second understanding. As she relaxed into her evening, she discovered a different type of knowledge than what she had acquired throughout the years of academic study. Emily's mind wandered to her previous life, where she had been at the top of her sector with expertise in producing studies on wildlife behavior that has won her acknowledgement across the scientific community. Yet something was lacking, a bond with the very animals she researched that was not possible to discover from the academic prism. Her co-workers had referred to the decision to depart as difficult, professional suicide, alerting her to the fact that she was wasting years of effort. But deep down, Emily had known that she needed this shift that the mountains had. A voice she couldn't ignore beckoned out to her, promising something more genuine than the esteemed conferences and research grants that previously characterized her success. While she was getting ready, Emily evaluated her evening tea, a custom she had carried over from her time in the city. Day's notes. The usual patterns of wildlife movement had changed with the arrival of winter. She had seen that there were fewer footprints in the snow and that the typical forest noises had become more distant, felt more intense than any winter she had yet encountered. The nightly weather report warning buzzed on the solar-powered radio on her counter during her time on the mountain. Despite the persistently dire circumstances, Emily mentally noted that she needed to check her emergency supplies first thing in the morning. Living alone for years had trained her to always be ready for her little route. As darkness descended on the area, cellar was well stocked and had enough firewood to endure through multiple storms. Mountain Emily walked around her cabin, making sure the windows and doors were locked. A behavior that was sparked by reverence for the wilderness rather than anxiety when the wind began to speed up again, throwing new waves of. She stopped at each window, her trained eyes studying the snow against the panes of glass, searching for any indications of creatures finding refuge in the white expanse beyond. The mountains had taught her to be patient during the storm, demonstrating to her that the most important moments frequently occurred when, tonight, she unexpectedly sat down in her favorite chair with her field. She couldn't get rid of the feeling in her journal that something was going to change the outcome. There was a sense of possibilities in the air, like just before a summer storm. Emily had no idea that this evening would signal the start of an incredible chapter in her life that would contradict all she believed to be true about wildlife survival and the unforeseen relationships that develop in the most trying conditions, as she recorded the day's events in her journal. Observations. The first whispers of a story were carried by the mountain breezes as they continued their age-old melody that would soon come to pass. The snow grew more intense as night fell on the mountains that turned the surroundings into a white whirling canvas. Emily sat at her desk with dancing shadows cast on her by the flickering lamplight. Weathered walls. Yet when she heard a strange noise, this was the usual howl of the wind or the creaking of limbs covered with snow. She initially thought it was just another ruse because it was distinct, almost organic in nature. She had learned how the wind could imitate different noises from sobbing after spending 3 years in the desert. She had learned how the wind could imitate different noises from sobbing, and after spending 3 years in the desert, babies to skulking predators. But there was something about this specific sound that made her feel uncomfortable in her professional skills. Emily's intuition brought back recollections of her years spent researching untamed cats. Whatever the circumstances, she was sure that these were the 2 nastiest little creatures she'd ever seen. Her socked feet were silent against the wooden floor as she moved away from her desk, but the sound became more distinct this time. A feeble pleading cry that appeared to vacillate between a whimper and a moan in her heart started to race when she heard the unique timbre, a sound she'd heard innumerable times throughout her years of investigation, but never this near human habitation. Grabbing for her hefty winter coat, Emily's thoughts were constantly racing with potential wild animals that she rarely saw, approaching homes until compelled by dire circumstances. The truth of many creatures had already been forced to change their regular behaviors this winter, but something about this felt different. The temperature sensor next to her indicated desperation in that cry. Or read as 25 to give for situations that even the toughest people could perish from. Emily grabbed her mountain animals and put on her insulated boots. A relic from her research days, the emergency medical pack was something she had kept more than a few years before. As she opened the door, the wind almost knocked her back due to its fierce strength, which was more habit than necessity. Her covered porch provided little shelter from the storm's wrath, and snow had drifted, so she grabbed the doorframe for support. It's the rails, forming tiny ice and frost mountain ranges. Emily's. A bright beam pierced the swirling snow as trained eyes searched the darkness, and then the cry resurfaced. Now that she was closer, she turned to face its source, and what she saw there made her breath seize in her throat. A female lynx reclined on her porch railing, a sight that contradicted everything she knew about the behavior of wild animals. Her gorgeous fur was covered in ice crystals as she coiled in the snow, yet it wasn't. 3 young cubs shook their tiny bodies around the weary mother. But only the adult cat attracted Emily's attention. Bodies battling the growing snowdrifts. The amber eyes of the mother lynx met Emily's, and a significant exchange between them occurred at that very time. There was simply tiredness, and what Emily could only see in those crazy eyes, not terror. Interpret Emily's seasoned stare and the large cat's flanks heaving with laborious respiration as forlorn hope. Observed faint indications that the animal might be carrying a new litter, and a very red event that spoke. Emily remained still, expressing the gravity of their predicament. Despite her impulses, her scientific mind told her to do what she had studied for years. At a safe distance, to let nature to do its thing. But as she observed one of the cubs struggle to stand in the heavy snow, she sensed a change within herself. Was now about trusting the unexpected rather than just surviving. When life-altering events occurred, the wind howled louder and drove fresh withholding in her efforts. She realized she just had a few seconds to decide whether to support the cubs in the snow on the porch. Would not be able to endure these conditions for very long, and their mother's condition was severe. but they were still taking in wild creatures. In particular, prejudice violated every rule she had ever been taught, or taught as snowflakes were falling on her shoulders as she stood there, and Emily recalled why she had quit her academic forum career, for the purpose of the career was not only to avoid the politics and demands of politics. The purpose of the career was not only to avoid the politics and demands of the career. The goal of university life was to discover a more genuine method to engage with a species she had studied all her life, and now she had the chance to display itself in its most pristine state, moving slowly and purposefully. Emily. The mother lynx's eyes tracked her every step as she started to return toward her door. However, the animal didn't try to run away. Instead, she appeared to observe with an almost human level of intensity, as if Emily's hand reached the doorknob and she gently pushed, realizing that this instant would decide the fate of her family. In the storm-darkened night it opened, forming a portal of warmth and light. What transpired next would start a series of events that would make Emily reevaluate her beliefs on wildlife. Human participation in conservation and the intricate relationships that can develop between species. As she stood in that doorway with the wind blowing all around her, Emily was unable to understand her choice. Would take her on a journey replete with unanticipated allies, concealed threats, and revelations that would upend the grounds of her isolated universe. The morning infrared glasses let in the first rays of windows, let in the first rays of dawn, illuminating a remarkable view. And the mother lynx, whom Emily had been mentally referring to as Aurora, was curled up in her small cabin. Emily's lonely life changed when her 3 cubs snuggled up next to the wood stove. Contrary to all she knew, the transition into a temporary wildlife shelter had gone surprisingly well. Observing the behavior of wild animals, Emily went about her morning routine in silence. Her years of fieldwork had taught her the value of moving slowly and deliberately. Using Aurora's sight to develop dependable patterns when working with wild animals, followed her, showing an uncommon amount of alertness without becoming aggressive. Of trust that Emily's scientific intellect found both fascinating and concerning, Emily noticed that the cubs, who were still frail after their experience in the storm, had started to show signs of improvement. Taking note of their actions in her field of expertise, Journal Cub, adapting nicely to the pleasant surroundings, she filled in the spaces with her precise handwriting. Age's mother, exhibiting a level of tolerance to human presence never before seen, potential indications of prior human interaction, or severe situations requiring Emily's thoughts shifted to the practical difficulties facing her cabin while she made her morning tea. Although plenty for one person, supplies would require careful rationing to accommodate her unforeseen guests. Emily was particularly concerned about Mother Lynx's condition because she had validated her first assumption that Aurora was in fact expecting again, a rare event that made an already difficult situation much more complicated. "You're quite," the Emily whispered, "surprise package, aren't you? Surprise package. Surprise package, aren't you?" As she watched Aurora gently. The lynx was growing as she groomed her cubs, and although the huge cat's ears twitched at her words, they showed no symptoms of discomfort. It seemed to transcend natural boundaries between them. Yet Emily remained acutely conscious of the untamed nature that persisted throughout the day in those amber eyes. Emily kept a careful record of every detail of her strange guest's behavior. Training began automatically, transforming her cabin into a special study space where she observed feeding habits, social contacts, and behavioral changes that made the cubs more resilient. With every hour that went along, the tiniest cub started investigating their new surroundings with the usual feline curiosity. Emily was especially drawn to it because of the distinctive pattern of spots on its ear, which showed extraordinary bravery for leaving its mother farther away than its siblings. Emily. She was intrigued to its spirit of adventure, which reminded her of her own desire to depart from the usual routes. And as night fell, Emily turned to face her. The first significant obstacle was that the storm outside had gotten worse once more, and she needed firewood. She would have to go to her storage shed because her supplies were running low, but she would have to leave the wild creatures in her cabin alone. Violated every safety precaution she had ever been taught. But something in Aurora's Emily assured her that trust was reciprocated. "I'll be right back," she added, gently, more for her personal comfort than for any prospect of comprehension. Aurora watched in awe as she put on her winter clothing and ventured outside into the bitterly cold trek to. Because of the heavy snow and roaring wind, the woodshed took longer than expected. Step a problem, as Emily packed firewood into her arms that she was unable to remove. The sensation that her environment had undergone a major change. The solitude she had chosen 3 years prior had changed into something completely new, not broken, but changed. When Emily returned to the cabin, everything was just as she had left it. Aurora had simply made a minor movement to better watch the door while the cubs slept in their tiny nest. Emily was captivated by the sight of corpses rising and falling while breathing peacefully. A strange tableau of domestic and natural elements coexisting in improbable harmony. Emily started to realize what she was seeing that evening as she jotted down notes in her journal by lamplight. These wild animals' unusual conduct went against what was generally believed to be. There was more going on here, something more difficult than wildlife rehabilitation. How far such techniques could go in the human brain, there was largely no testing, but the prospect is pleasing. Her scientific knowledge while igniting a more profound and intuitive understanding of the wind's relentless attack on the cottage. But Emily discovered that something else was happening within. Throughout her years of investigation, she had wondered about the circumstances that had led this family to seek human assistance. As she penned her concluding notes, she had never seen anything quite like this. Throughout the day, she couldn't get rid of the impression that this story was about more than just looking up for survival. Emily noticed Aurora's eyes in her journal. The Lynx's eyes contained secrets, tales of instinct and survival that Emily could only speculate about. But as she down for the evening to keep watch over her strange visitors, Emily was unable to predict that these secrets would soon put her in a predicament that was much more complicated than she could have ever imagined. After Aurora and her cubs had sought safety in Emily's cabin for a week, a routine had started to take shape. Emily discovered that she had to adjust to the cadence of her untamed visitors. With every day that went by, the cubs' scientific interest grew. Their amusing antics are also unexpectedly providing delight to Aurora's formerly peaceful home. Exhibited impressive recovery, however, that morning, vigilant observation was necessary due to her growing pregnancy. Emily first observed a difference in Aurora's behavior, a slight alteration in the Lynx's demeanor. The large cat had grown restless and was continually shifting between the windows and her ears. After years of researching wild cats, Emily's twitching at noises she couldn't hear told Emily to put her heavy coat on and trust these gut instincts. As she went outside on her porch for her daily morning inspection of the area, the storm had finally drained away, revealing an unspoiled area of snow, but as she looked around, noticing a disturbance in the immaculate white blanket next to the. As the tree line drew nearer, her pulse raced upon realizing what she was witnessing. Human footprints. Emily crouched to look more closely at the trails, her trained eye detecting nuances that made her shiver. Body that was unrelated to the cold. The prints were probably just formed in the last few hours, and they made a free-flowing circle around her cabin. Emily discovered Aurora standing watchfully inside her house, with amber eyes after someone had been watching it all night. The cubs, noticing their mother's anxiety, had gathered around the window. The tranquil haven of the previous week was suddenly felt in the area that Emily had decorated with worn blankets. Drawing from her years of outdoor experience, Emily started off feeling vulnerable and exposed. As a precaution, she made sure the locks on each window were tight and made a list of her belongings. Her satellite phone is typically confined to a preoccupied thought. The emergency drawer was now conveniently located, but she was unable to shake. Fearing that these steps would not be sufficient as evening drew near, Emily sat at her desk, trying to concentrate on Aote. Throughout her years of solitude, the scratching of her pen in her notebook entries was unable to conceal the rising uneasiness in her head. Although there were risks in the wilderness, they were natural, and she had never felt endangered in her mountain refuge. This was unexpected, and the human incursion inside her was meticulously preserved. Emily's thoughts were interrupted by World Aurora's abrupt snarl, and the Lynx remained. Emily walked stealthily to join her, her fur slightly lifted and rigid by the window. For a little period, she could only see shadows among the trees as she peered out into the gathering darkness, but suddenly she noticed movement, drew her attention. A glimmer of light swiftly went out someplace around the edge of the woodland, and Emily's thoughts raced through possibilities. Few people traveled this far, and the closest town was hours away. Into the mountains, particularly in the winter, and no public map showed where her cabin was located. Due to its remoteness, anyone who happened upon this location had to have a reason why Emily sat in her chair that night, since she couldn't seem to get any sleep. Observing Aurora's cabin floor, as silver patterns were created by moonlight, stayed alert, her presence strangely reassuring in the cub's shadow. They slept soundly, oblivious to the stress that pervaded their temporary residence in the silent hours before dawn. Emily started putting her years of research into a strategy, had instilled in her the value of recording. She took her old camera out of storage and cleaned the lens. Whatever was going on, she needed to meticulously document everything. She would be watching back the morning if someone were keeping an eye on her cottage. Emily's routine went on with fresh snow and a false sense of peace, but now each action came with increased awareness. She saw elements that she might have overlooked previously, such as broken branches that led to torture and depravity. As she stood on her doorstep, she noticed patterns in the snow that spoke of human presence, yet couldn't be explained by the weather. As Emily surveyed the immaculate surroundings, she couldn't help but feel as though she was missing something significant. From Aurora's persistent uneasiness indicated that the threat had not subsided. If anything, given that the Lynx's actions suggested that it might be approaching, Emily went back to her desk and opened her journal to a new search. She typed on page 8, then stopped, her pen hanging over the page, wondering how she could find compassion and love that filled her heart with joy. Her scientific expertise required facts and data, so she documented this developing sense of threat without providing any hard proof, observable things. But every aspect of this circumstance went against the commentary. Emily felt the burden of seeing Aurora and her cubs. As the weight of duty grew on her shoulders, she had unintentionally become these amazing creatures' guardians, and it now appeared that Rose could need more of her than she had anticipated. As she observed the tiniest cub jokingly poking at its siblings, she silently vowed to shield them from any difficulties that could arise. The morning light brought new Emily's cabin. Had snow outside, but the immaculate white surface did nothing to alleviate her mounting nervousness. 2 weeks had gone by since Aurora and her cubs had come to her for refuge, and every day presented further evidence that their sanctuary might not be as safe as she had anticipated. The footprints she found were just the start. Further disturbances pointed to a more enduring presence. Emily sipped her morning tea while viewing her house from her window. Now, after major installation, Emily began finding new situations that required work. The linkages had established a pattern of pacing between particular locations in the cabin after monitoring Aurora's behavior, always stopping to gaze carefully through specific windows. As her cubs developed, became stronger every day, and, as if realizing, stayed abnormally silent during these times. Their mother's worry, "What do you think I'm missing?" they whispered while they watched. Aurora's studying crazy made her ears quiver at every little sound. She had learned from cats that their instincts were usually correct, and the Lynx's actions indicated a danger that was, both close by and enduring something more planned than haphazard. Wilderness Emily started going over her most recent journal notes once wanderers moved to her desk. recording all anomalous events, regardless of how minor fragments of wind patterns that couldn't account for the disturbed snow, the sporadic gleam of metal among the trees that vanished too soon to recognize even, the odd quiet that, occasionally, it seemed as though the local wildlife was holding its breath as it fell over the woodland. Aurora had become rigid after seeing a rapid flicker in her eye via the window. Emily grabbed her binoculars and followed the lynx's gaze, initially focusing on something in the distance. Saw only the typical scene of trees and snow, and then a shadow moved. Too meticulous to be a lost hiker, too methodical to be an animal amongst the pines. Emily's heart pounded as she snatched up her camera, but before she could focus the lens, the figure was disappeared. However, she continued to observe, recording the time and place in her journal. As nighttime drew near, Emily realized that this was the closest any of the enigmatic guests had come to revealing themselves during the day. Fortunately, she had discovered that she had begun putting up indicators as part of new security procedures. The last thing she wanted was for Katie to rejoin their little group. Little twigs were put in the snow in patterns that would show if someone had went by at night. Her windows were once kept open to greet the stranger. The improvised coverings for the mountain views could now be sketched rapidly. Aurora appeared to approve of these efforts, closely observing Emily as she walked around the cabin to secure their refuge, and the cubs, sensing the aura of the tent, remained nearer to their mother. More unusually little one, which Emily had codenamed Scout because of its unusual build. With its large eyes tracking Emily's moves, nature leaned against Aurora's side. That evening, Emily sat in her chair by the wood stove and wrote in her journal while the temperature dropped and the wind increased. She had been recording Aurora's pregnancy progress while keeping it open on her lap. The minor alterations in the lynx's physical state and behavior that were made to the lap of the impending birth would further complicate their circumstances and increase their susceptibility. Already in a vulnerable posture, Aurora's head shot up when a piercing crack from outside pierced her thoughts. Emily went discreetly to look into her, with her eyes set on the back window. With her flashlight ready but not illuminated, she could see moving objects through the glass. Since their shapes were hardly discernible against the snow in the darkness, Emily's hand automatically reached for her satellite phone. But she didn't make the call. Who would she call to get in touch with the local authorities? Hours away, and aside from what she was informed, she had no evidence of any misconduct, that the situation can worsen rather than improve if officials are involved. Rather, she took out her old research camera and placed it close to the window. When the motion sensor triggered, she would assemble if someone was observing her cabin. Proof that her scientific education had instilled in her the importance of recording, constructing a case using verifiable data as opposed to merely conjecture. Emily couldn't help but wonder as she worked why Aurora had shown up at her door at that precise moment. Enigmatic watchers, the growing audacity of their monitoring seemed. She looked at the Lynx family, who were now snuggled together, too well coordinated to be accidental. Aurora's perceptive amber eyes caught hers as they stood alongside the stove basketball-wise, and Emily later felt the weight of their unsaid trust once more. At night, as the cubs slept soundly and the wind howled outside, Emily added a fresh article in her journal. The number of onlookers keeps growing. Despite her discomfort, she wrote steadily. Aurora's behavior indicates their more in-depth inquiries are still needed to determine who they are, what they desire, and most. The last thing that worried her the most was where her cabin was, and how did they know to check here? Purposefully obscure, picked specially because of how alone someone would be. Need specific expertise to locate it, particularly in these weather circumstances. Emily felt that there was much more to this issue than she had yet realized as she put her journal away. Emily had gone out to check on her after learning that the finding had occurred at daybreak. Morning marks, she discovered, a steel trap with its lethal jaws open, half concealed beneath the new snow, and her blood ran cold while she waited and closely inspected the device. Professional grade, the type that seasoned trappers employ, this wasn't a random placement. Someone used her field to purposefully place it close to her property. If the letters she was writing representative of her feeling process, on this case it bears any indication, it could just as easily have been written by a so-called expert. Competence. Emily used rehearsed motions to break the trap, her mind racing with ramifications. After 3 weeks of Aurora and her cubs taking refuge in her cabin, this revelation validated her darkest suspicions that the enigmatic onlookers weren't merely observing, they were getting ready for something back inside. Aurora gave her a fierce look. The cubs played close to the woods, as though they understood how serious the situation was. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she worked on the stove, blissfully oblivious to the growing danger. As she drew the trap's design using scientific methods and wrote the morning's discovery to her journal. We must be more precise, since her years of research had taught her to record everything, no matter how upsetting. Emily was cautious and talked quietly to Aurora, who was observing her with those bright amber eyes. In recent days, the Lynx had become noticeably more protective of her cubs, preventing children from near windows and reacting to any strange noises she hears. Her motions became more intentional as her pregnancy progressed, but she stayed vigilant. Throughout the day, her instincts were constantly alerting her to the impending danger. Emily kept examining her cabin's surrounds and found additional indications of human activity. Odd scratches and shattered branches that weren't created by snow weight on trees, that appeared to be arranged in a sequence, and most concerningly, what looked like communication devices concealed among the tiniest Cub Scout had started trailing Emily through the thick bush. By imitating her vigilant actions, its siblings stayed nearer to Aurora. However, Scout occasionally appeared interested in Emily's surveillance efforts when Emily scanned the tree line from the windows, hoping the little cub might join her. As dusk drew near, its small head cocked, as though it shared Emily's alertness. Started putting new security measures in place, covering the windows with thick blankets, allowing for minimal surveillance gaps. Her emergency supplies were originally kept in the shed, was now dispersed throughout the cabin, and the satellite phone was still there in case they needed to move fast. Charged and accessible, but she was still hesitant to use. The wind intensified as night fell, bringing with it the creaking sound of branches beneath a thick layer of snow. Emily sat at her computer. Aurora was writing down the day's observations in her journal when she suddenly became tense. The Lynx's gaze was fixated on the back door, and Emily moved when her fur lifted a little, softly, to examine her racing heart through a little opening in the window covering where she noticed movement. Several shadows in the darkness moved between the trees in a more coordinated manner than prior to a bright beam momentarily sweeping across the snow and swiftly going out. Yet, before Emily saw something that made her stomach turn, she saw new boot prints that led straight to her barn. Groped for her camera, being cautious to conceal the lens behind the curtain because she needed proof, something tangible to confirm her suspicions, as she observed one of the shadows separating from the woods. The figure paused as she moved stealthily and purposefully toward her cabin, appearing to examine the building's design before withdrawing into the shadows that made it impossible for Emily to sleep that night. Remained vigilant while sitting in her chair and seeing the moonlight coming in through the cracks in the window curtains, Aurora kept her body in a protective position over her cubs and stayed equally vigilant. Their predicament was made even more urgent by the pregnant Lynx condition. They were running out of time. Early in the morning, before the new cubs would come, Emily made a unsettling connection in her journal. The enigmatic observer's apparition occurred, too perfectly, at the same time as someone had probably foreseen Aurora's coming and knew the Lynx family would visit. But how, and more significantly, why? Emily encountered challenging circumstances as dawn drew closer. Queries her remote cabin, which was previously a haven for introspection and study, had evolved into the focal point of something far more intricate. The existence of the trap verified that the person observing had no intention of being peaceful, but she was unable to. As she watched Aurora and her cubs Emily, she couldn't get rid of the impression that she was still lacking important pieces of the puzzle. felt the burden of accountability bearing down on her shoulders, having made the decision to this lonesome existence to research and save wildlife, and now that dedication was being put to the test in ways she never could have predicted. Whatever came next, she realized she couldn't give up too easily, because it all rested on her solving this riddle. Emily fell asleep in her chair before the generator's abrupt silence woke her up. Weary of being on guard all the time, the cabin's normally tightly controlled temperature started rising and slowly drove right out of control. The electricity in the crew cabin reached a level that a rival stove consistently missed, and dropped right away. Aurora's eyes glowed in the shadows, were a mechanical malfunction. After all, the generator had been running non-stop for weeks, yet Aurora's low growl could be heard as she put on her coat and boots. Implied something more sinister. Emily had learnt to use the Lynx's behavior as an early warning system. With unquestioned trust, Emily grabbed her flashlight and cautiously walked up to the window. New footprints were found in the snow near the generator shed by moonlight. Her heart fell. This wasn't a purposeful technical malfunction. Aurora's timing couldn't have been worse when they interfered with their power source. Pregnancy had progressed much, and the cubs required constant warmth. Emily muttered to herself more than to her irrational guests. Figure this out. Swiftly went about the cabin carrying out her emergency procedures. Additional blankets were given out, and she, sensing the shift in the environment, the cubs crowded closer to the wood burner to make up for the losing heat. Everyone is done with their class validation. See their names in the adjustments. Scout, the youngest cub's mother, observed Emily's behavior with strange intensity during the previous weeks. The little Lynx had taken on an almost eerie aspect, and now that Emily was working to secure their shelter, Scout was able to reflect her feelings. Kept a watchful stance that appeared almost human in its knowledge of a metallic hum. Emily froze as she heard a clang outside, and Aurora's ears turned in the direction of it. Her body tensed when she heard the sounds coming from the generator shed, implying that the person who had disrupted their power source was still in the area. Emily's thoughts whirled through the possibilities she could look into it, but leaving the cabin would expose those within. Felt just as dangerous because they were essentially stranded without satellite power. There was only one reception bar visible when they called their lifeline to the outer world. The signal was being further disrupted by the storm that had been intensifying throughout the day. Keeping them apart, Emily had been reluctant to ask for assistance, since she knew that involving authorities might question her peculiar house guests in an awkward way. As she considered their next course of action, she was now being pushed to make that decision. Through the holes in the window covering, Emily could see several things that made her blood chill. Unlike the earlier covert views, lights are moving through the foliage. Movements appeared more deliberate and well-coordinated, and the observers were no longer satisfied to merely observe Aurora's actions. Validated Emily's concerns. The Lynx had placed herself between her cubs and the windows, displaying her muscles clearly. Even in her advanced pregnancy state, Aurora's tense under her heavy winter coat. With her protective instincts still keen, she slid with purposeful grace between the gaps in the proceedings. Emily's journal was acquired by vantage points that tracked her travels outside, adding quick notes about what happened that night, as required by her scientific background paperwork. Even during a power outage, she penned her typically tidy. Aurora's handwriting displaying symptoms of stress was verified by many onlookers. Displaying more distressing symptoms and putting cubs at risk because of the falling temperatures, the immediate issue was that cabin's temperature would keep dropping without the generator. But the wood burner would provide some warmth. However, it wouldn't be sufficient for the whole area, so Emily started constructing a smaller shelter inside the main room utilizing the Walter axe. As she worked, she used furniture and blankets to create a temporary den that would better keep heat. Kept going back to the timing of everything. The generator's sabotage wasn't haphazard. Rather, it was a planned action. To compel her hand, but why would they want the trap she had discovered there? They hadn't taken any direct action against the cabin, despite prior indications that their goals weren't benign. Emily checked her supplies as a strong blast of wind rocked the windows, bringing with it the threat of another storm. They had enough food and firewood for several days, if you counted the leftover supplies. However, their predicament would worsen if the lights went out, especially with Aora's pregnancy added. Additional sense of urgency because the cubs will be arriving shortly and they required a safe descent. In the dark, Emily sensed footsteps softly approaching her in a warm setting. In an unexpected display of solidarity, Scout had stepped outside the group's safety to join her vigil, pressing against her leg. Then the sound had stopped, and she spotted a togetherness. The tiny cub's existence offered a peculiar sense of comfort and a reminder of why, as the night became darker, Emily couldn't just leave their sanctuary to face the unknown dangers outside, kept an eye out the window, recording any movement she might see in the forest's lights, positioned themselves in a loose perimeter around the cabin, making her feel more and more confined. But something about the actions implied that they were waiting. But Emily's glance Aurora looked at her with those perceptive amber eyes, and it appeared like they were linked. His comprehension that this power move was only the start of whatever plans their observers had. Simply the first move in a game that was getting riskier by the minute. Didn't improve their circumstances. When Emily awoke from her awkward window-side position, frost was there, accumulating on the interior of the glass. Without electricity, the cabin's temperature had become dangerously low. Aurora and Emily had made a temporary den for her cubs to retreat to, but even there, Emily's breath created clouds in the air as the cold became a major worry. Aurora's pregnancy had advanced when she went to see how her charges were doing. The Lynx's sides heaved with every breath she took, and the strain of their circumstances wasn't helping either. The cubs cuddled close, Scout as usual being the first to do so, their gorgeous fur coat puffed up against the cold. Notice Emily's presence when they heard branches breaking outside of Drew. Emily moved warily to the window through the frost-covered glass, remaining low and hidden. She noticed several sets of fresh tracks traveling purposefully across the snow on her land. The observers had increased in number. Emily's journal was open on her desk, its pages brimming with more and more explicit information. Day 24, urgent observations. She scribbled with her hands, trembling a little from the cold and tension temperature decreasing sharply. Aurora displaying early labor symptoms that observers are not aware of. The words didn't seem to adequately describe the fact that the perimeter generator is still damaged. The seriousness of their predicament. She noticed a bright flash of metal in the morning light. Someone had left. Emily's heart pounded when she noticed something on her porch that had been purposefully positioned so she could see it from the window. Identified the item as a sturdy animal trap that resembled the one she had discovered previously, but this one was fresh and untouched. It was a message rather than simply equipment left in the snow. Emily's gaze was drawn back within the Lynx by Aurora's deep growl. Despite her state, she was able to stand up, and her eyes were focused on something beyond of Emily's line of sight. Observed activity at the clearing's edge, a figure less watchful than before, inspecting what seemed to be abruptly. The implication struck Emily like a physical blow. The surveillance equipment concealed in the trees wasn't a coincidence. Observers noticed that they were setting up with professional equipment, coordination, and most concerningly, patience. For a particular reason, and Emily felt that it was entirely related to Aurora's impending delivery of Scout. The little cub's body shook slightly when rubbed against Emily's knee. Regardless of Emily, couldn't tell if the move was made out of fear or cold, but it made her more determined. She rushed swiftly about the cottage, gathering goods in key places in case they had to relocate. She tried to get ready as soon as possible, but the poor signal from the satellite phone made fun of her. From the desk, even if she were able to contact authorities at this point, what would she say to them about having a family of wild lynx who were being threatened by unidentified onlookers? As the day went on, Emily saw a shift in Aurora's status, which raised more concerns than it would answer. The Lynx behavior had been more agitated as they moved around the den in various places, breathing more heavily than before, which Emily knew were early indicators that the cubs would be in labor. Yet, prepared or not, the timing couldn't have been worse in the absence of electricity. It would be practically impossible for Emily to keep the newborn cubs at a comfortable temperature, because she had already expended a lot of exposing herself to whatever was waiting in the trees when she left her emergency firewood and went to the woodshed. Late in the afternoon, they heard a new sound that was different from... Emily looked through the glass to observe camera equipment being set up at several locations using mechanical equipment. The observers were recording everything on her land in anticipation of something specific. Emily's scientific urge took over her journal. Her thoughts were racing with potential outcomes. Someone was aware of the equipment, the coordinated surveillance, and the time of it. If they were there, and perhaps they had even followed the Lynx family to Aurora's cottage because of her pregnancy. But what they intended to accomplish, and more importantly how, after the cubs arrived, the temperature decreased even further as darkness descended, and Emily had centered their living area around the wood stove, making it a small space. Aurora's furnishings and blankets were arranged in a cluster, trapping the remaining heat. Emily kept her vigil close by as she lay in the middle with her cubs pressed close. New voices and the crunch of boots were borne by the wind as darkness fell. When they heard the metallic click of equipment being adjusted in the snow, their observers were getting ready for a hurricane. Emily could sense it coming in the dark, like a storm on the horizon. Comforted by the little cub's trust, Emily reached out to rub Scout's fur. She was aware that tomorrow would present fresh difficulties, and since Aurora's health was getting worse, their options were precarious. Like with their other hopes, however, Emily realized that whatever was coming would need to be more and more constrained. All she had discovered over her years of working in wildlife research, and maybe even more crucially, concerning survival and trust in the last few weeks. The tipping point was Emily had witnessed Aurora's progressively strained breathing throughout another restless night before the light, heard the distinct sound of cars driving through the snow. Her former love of solitude had turned into their biggest weakness. It was hours away, but dangers may come through the frozen layer at any time. Through the early morning darkness outside her windows, she could see at least 3 pairs of headlights. Aurora realized that onlookers had seemingly chosen to forego subtlety. Alter right away, her strong muscles tensing in spite of her tired state. In response to their mother's worry, the cubs, among them the ever-vigilant Scout, pressed closer to Emily's hands, trembled as she wrote what might have been her last journal entry on day 25. Vehicles approaching Aurora with advanced labor temperature indicators and extremely limited options. Clinical language belies the resolve and dread coursing through her body. The car halted just as her subjects were about to be threatened, shattering years of scientific detachment. Emily noted that their headlights cast long shadows on the snow-covered plain beyond the tree line. 6 figures were seen preparing what looked to be top-notch equipment in the pre-dawn light. Weren't haphazard hunters or inquisitive residents. Rather, it was a planned effort. Emily's focus was drawn back into the room by Aurora's abrupt, quick intake of breath. Lynx's labor was going more quickly, and now her sides were heaving more frequently. The timing couldn't have been worse. Even worse, it would be hard to move her, but being where they were made them terrifyingly close. Sensing their mother's anguish, the cubs huddled closer, feeling defenseless, while Scout remained in a protective position. The tense atmosphere was broken by a harsh knock at the entrance of their makeshift den. When a voice cried out the first word, Emily's heart jumped into her throat. At the direct communication from their observers over the course of several weeks, Miss Carter, we need to speak because we know you're in there. Emily could hear the steel underneath the professional, almost friendly voice that was speaking about what you're protecting. Being courteous, her mind whirled through possibilities, each one appearing worse than the previous. The storm that had been developing all night was interfering with reception, and the satellite phone was still showing no service. As they moved in silence, Emily packed her emergency supplies, because they were really alone. As they got closer to Aurora's location, the linkages observed her motions, their perceptive amber eyes appearing to realize that something important was going to happen. The cubs, sensing the tension, stayed remarkably motionless. Another knock, more, their tiny bodies pushed together for warmth and comfort. Insistent this time, Ms. Carter, please show some common sense. Doesn't have to be challenging. All we want to do is record the birth. Consider the scientific significance of the words, Emily said. Like a physical blow, how many times had she exploited the same scientific value phrase in her studies? But this time, these individuals had little interest in conservation or hospitality. Their acts of protection revealed additional motivations that made Emily's skin crawl. Aurora's breathing had gotten harder, her strong body getting ready for... Emily realized they were running out of time because of the impending delivery. The observers outside, they were obviously aware of the Lynx's health and had carefully planned this encounter, waiting until after dark. As their firewood ran out, the cabin's temperature continued to plummet, making Aurora the most susceptible. Emily had covered the cubs with as many blankets as she could find, but it wouldn't be enough for them to survive the stove fire. Newborn kittens without assistance or power, their circumstances were getting worse. A fresh sound pierced the pre-dawn quiet, growing more urgent. Mechanical setup of equipment. Through the openings in the window covering, Emily noticed that cameras were set up all over the cabin, ready to record whatever transpired. Next, despite her refusal to cooperate, Scout placed Emily's leg against the cub's presence served as a reminder of the dangers in the weeks after Aurora had sought safety. Emily had observed the cub's growth in strength and personality development in her cabin. She became physically ill as a result of them being treated like inanimate scientific specimens. "We're about ready to enter, Miss Carter," and the voice outside got closer this time. "Please don't make things any worse." Emily looked at Aurora and said, "We have all the necessary permits and authorizations, so it's harder than it needs to be." The Lynx's gaze was filled with a mix of anguish and trust as their eyes met in the faint light. Additionally, Emily sensed a strong resolve reverberating within her own heart, regardless of what lay ahead. They would confront it together, apart from the storm that had threatened them all night. The wind howled through the trees as it finally broke, slamming sheets of snow against the cabin windows and producing an ethereal setting for their crisis. Emily was aware that she would soon have to make a choice that would impact not just her own destiny, but also the lives of all the creatures on which she had become dependent. The pre-dawn calm was broken by the sound of glass cracking on her protection. Perhaps the frigid air surged through the cabin because one of the back windows had collapsed due to the storm's intensity. In adding snowballs and a fresh sense of urgency to their already prolific work, Aurora's labor had accelerated due to the dire circumstances, and her strong body was getting ready. Emily hurried to cover the hole with blankets in anticipation of the impending arrival of her new cubs, her thoughts rushing through. She saw movement outside through the openings of her makeshift barricade, with several persons gathered on the dais, holding up the line noise from their cameras' gloomy shadows against the snow and the camera's mechanical parts. "Miss Carter," the voice continued, now interspersed with radio talk and the crunch of boots on frozen ground. "We are aware of your investigation and understand why the weather has become more difficult. Really froze Emily in place of your papers on Lynx after leaving academia with those statements. Breeding patterns attracted a lot of attention, particularly your hypotheses regarding extremely rare multiple pregnancies. Circumstances all suddenly fell into place in Emily's final research paper. Prior to departing, academia had published a contentious theory that some multiple pregnancies in linked groups could be caused by environmental stressors, a hitherto unknown survival mechanism, but her conclusions were rejected by the scholarly community. Evidently, someone had been listening, because Aurora growled softly. With Scout keeping its protective stance, the cubs gathered closer to their mother, their amber gaze riveted on the glass. Standing next to Emily, she could hear more cars approaching with roaring engines amidst the storm's rage. "Miss Carter, consider your career in the The voice continues to document evidence of your theory. In severe circumstances, we can provide proof of a multiple pregnancy to ensure you repair your reputation and receive full credit." Emily's fists pressed into fists. They assumed this was about her reputation, so she looked at Aurora. Recalling the night the Lynx took sanctuary on her porch, this had nothing to do with job advancement or scientific confirmation. Progress, it was about trust and safeguarding something valuable from barbarians. The tiniest Cub Scout snuggled against her leg, and those who would take advantage of it. Emily's tiny body shook as she realized with crystal clarity. The Lynx hadn't just been the reason Aurora had picked her cottage as her sanctuary. Seeking refuge from the storm, she may have been evading these individuals for weeks in order to safeguard her pregnant children. A new voice joined the chorus outside, one that sent shivers down the spine, coming from those who would make their birth a show. Professor Matthews is the voice that belonged to Emily's spine, the individual who once supported her research before openly rejecting her findings, who was also her former academic advisor. "This might be your vindication of the betrayal, so you don't have to remain enemies." Stung, even though Matthews had known where to look for her for all these years, possibly even foreseen Aurora's approach. The intricate monitoring, the professional tools, and meticulous planning were used to wait for the ideal time when the expectant mother Aurora's respiration had accelerated, making Lynx the most vulnerable. Sides heaving more frequently, indicating that the cubs are aware of their mother's distress, stayed remarkably motionless, pressing their little bodies close for warmth, and shivering the whole time until the autopsy was completed in 1982. However, the broken window had let valuable heat escape, and Emily's scientific mind raced as the cabin's temperature rapidly dropped. By considering, evaluating, and eliminating choices, the observers outside had the benefit of quantity and equipment, but they also had a well-defined plan, required Aurora to be alive, and the birth certificate provided her with some power. Emily thought, here the process is light, and the birth certificate provided her with some power. Enough flexibility to move swiftly, she started gathering certain things for her. Water containers, emergency blankets, and a medical kit if they wished to record. They would have to follow her instructions for this birth. She wouldn't allow Aurora's confidence to be violated. When the storm persisted, cubs were reduced to mere specimens in someone's study paper. Increase its rage in proportion to the tension that is growing around the cabin through the safety bubble. Emily could see more equipment being set up with strong lights in the swirling snow, extra cameras that appeared to be portable heating units. They were getting ready for a protracted siege with the intention of await the birth or her opposition to Scout's abruptly vigilant stance. Emily was drawn to the little cub's forward-facing ears and stiff body as it followed the object's gaze through the openings in the window covering. Emily noticed movement in the woods rather than the herd this time. Observers noticed something else that caused her heart skip a beat. As dawn started to peak above the mountain, Emily felt a new sense of hope and decided she had decided to live alone in order to better safeguard the animals she was now studying, not to get away from her background. She would demonstrate that her decision was the right one by gaining Aurora's trust and holding the lives of the present and future cubs in her hands. Had been correct, as the snow-covered landscape was painted by the first rays of dawn, with pink and gold hues, producing a landscape that is quite serene and overlooks the Emily's cabin inside Aurora's labor had become more tense. Notably, her strong physique, getting ready for the impending arrival of her new cubs. The current cubs, including the ever-vigilant Scouts, continued to cuddle their little bodies near their mother. Emily accompanied them in the progressively colder hut, offering what warmth they could. Her actions were guided by her years of field experience and purposeful efficiency, placed emergency blankets thoughtfully throughout Aurora's room, and kept her medical kits close at hand. The damaged window of the makeshift den was still covered, but cold air continued to creep in. The weather will only become worse as the improvised barrier creates whirling patterns of frost on the cabin walls. Even worse, Emily, Professor Matthews called from outside because you are unable to keep the temperature at a suitable level. His voice projected a fake air of concern. Let's help. We're powerless in there. That gave Emily the chills because she had previously trusted and believed in this man. Emily could see the intricate arrangement they were using through the holes in the pane, hiding his integrity as a mentor and scientist. It erected surrounding her cabin, and numerous cameras stationed there as bright lights filled the space with artificial light. Prepared to record every second, a sizable tent had been set up close by, loaded with what seemed to be sophisticated monitoring equipment. They had planned for this and weren't rushing it. Carefully for this particular moment, Aurora's abrupt, rapid breath intake drew Emily looked back inside, and the Lynx's amber eyes met hers. Both Emily recalled a tidbit from her early study days that had seemed to be related to pain and trust. Lynx mothers occasionally looked for particular places, which seemed unimportant at the time but now have new significance, for giving birth and going back to locations where they had previously raised cubs successfully. Emily whispered to Aurora that they had been following you for some time, so you know why you were here. Location would be secure, and the Lynx's unwavering stare appeared to support her suspicion. Aurora purposefully sorted this rather than making a haphazard decision out of desperation, possibly realizing in Emily a guardian rather than an observer when they left her cabin. Outside, there was an increase in radio activity and the sound of additional equipment being set up, installing heat lamps, and Matthews declared that, after the cabin is warm again, may move on with appropriate documentation. Consider your legacy, Emily. This could transform our comprehension of the phrase Lynx breeding patterns legacy, replayed in Emily's head as she examined the family that was in danger while she was protecting them. Her true legacy wasn't in research funding or scholarly articles. This wild monster was here, in the trust. Had put in her Aurora had specifically picked her since she had left from those who would take advantage of nature's mysteries instead of preserving them. Emily saw Scout's attentive demeanor once more. The little cub was looking at something with intense focus. The glass, displaying curiosity instead of fear in its body language, after its Emily's sight revealed activity in the trees beyond the observer's modest lights. Emily's hands went to her as the shadows changed, hinting at something or someone else observing the action. Notebook with what could be her last entry regarding Aurora's geographical choice, intentional prior success in the field, such as having some observers present but not all. Despite the fact that her scientific training required recording, these remarks were not just data on the storm. They were a record of faith. Kept getting stronger, and the wind was blotting out part of the action outside Emily. Heard annoyance seeping into the observer communications as they battled to keep their apparatus in. Nature itself was posing a threat to their carefully thought-out approach due to the worsening weather. By adding an element, Aurora's breathing rhythm changed, indicating that they were unable to regulate the pandemonium. Emily positioned herself next to the Lynx, her movements calm and confident amid the bustle, knowing that the birth was imminent. Understanding the significance of the moment, the cubs kept maintaining a respectable distance, yet remaining near enough to comfort their mother away from the spotlights of onlookers. Produced a striking contrast between light and shadow, but Emily's focus was on the shadows outside. Something was moving outside on this fake day, and it made her heart race with unexpected optimism that maybe Aurora had been even more strategic in her choice of place than she had first thought. Emily made her last preparations as the wind whipped about the cabin. She had studied these for years, amazing beings that are learning their patterns and actions because they realize that knowledge will be useful in a different way. Not to record or examine, but to safeguard and conserve the very thing that her initial interest in wildlife biology sprang from. The unbridled, unadulterated spirit of By nature's standards, the storm's intensity peaked, sending waves of protective sweat. Inside the hut, Emily worked resolutely despite the snow hitting the walls. Her focus was split between Aurora's labor developing and the escalating violence outside the interior. As the weather deteriorated, observers started to move closer to the cabin where their patients were staying. "This is your last warning, Emily," Professor Matthews, threatening to ruin their meticulously planned operation. "Don't force us to do actions that can upset the subject. We are ready to enter the cabin, borne over the wind," the clinical terms used to confirm Aurora as the subject, he said. Everything Emily had learned about the real nature of her former mentor. However, Emily saw something that the observers had overlooked since they were too preoccupied with their tools and cameras to read the subtle clues in the surrounding woods, indicated that the movement in the shadows outside of their lights had intensified. More deliberately, Scout had repeatedly brought it to the attention of the little cub, and attracted to particular locations in the shadows outside of the man-made glare. Emily's attention was drawn back into the Lynx by Aurora's abrupt, sharp movement. Had moved in an instinctive attempt to find the best position for giving delivery, but there was more in her actions, a sense of purpose that transcended simple biological necessity. She was anticipating something that would time her actions to Emily, was just starting to make sense of some internal rhythm through the gaps. Emily could sense the observers' growing displeasure as their pricey equipment battled against the window covering. The cameras and lights of the storm's fury swayed in the strong wind, had turned into an unanticipated ally, upsetting their meticulous plans and causing mayhem. "The Forest Service will arrive within the hour," Matthews called out, "according to their ordered papers." With a sense of urgency in his voice, "They will challenge your unauthorized handling of protected Emily. Please be reasonable and allow us to handle this professionally." As if there was anything professional about ambushing a pregnant wild animal. The professional smiled at the irony. She glanced at Aurora, seeing in those amber eyes the attempt to manipulate a natural miracle into a controlled experiment. The same wild spirit that initially drew her to wildlife biology, Emily saw Scout's unusual awareness. See. The little cub had changed positions, its eyes riveted. Emily noticed what the observer's lights had obscured as she followed the object's line of sight through the broken glass. With every second that goes by, shadowy shapes that are moving through the trees get closer. Aurora's presence was causing the forest to react in ways that Emily's scientific apparatus could never measure. Her thoughts immediately returned to her early studies and the patterns she had recorded but never thoroughly realized. That stood linkages were more than lone individuals. They intricate social networks that are essential to their existence, yet undetectable to the human eye. Survival. Aurora had not only picked this spot because it was safe, she had done so on purpose. The wind abruptly changed, bringing with it the knowledge that assistance would arrive. Fresh noises, delicate movements in the undergrowth, and the gentle crunch of snow beneath the observers continued to practice while concentrating on their cameras and equipment. Unaware of the gathering presence surrounding them, nature was preparing a defense against their encroachment. Her breathing altered once more, becoming more deliberate and regulated, like she was time. Emily came to the realization that working with powers beyond human, comprehending that the current cubs naturally pressed closer to their mother, taking part in this age-old dance of Emily gathered the necessary items quickly in order to ensure her survival and protection. She had learned to interpret the clues from her years in the bush to know when nature was getting ready to make its presence known. The observers believed they had control over their control. Despite the lights, cameras, and specialized technology, they failed to realize that they were seeing something much greater. The storm intensified beyond what their devices could measure, and the wind blew through the digitation of the lights of the trees, flickered with an almost supernatural force. In their aggravation, cameras that were having trouble focusing in the whiteout conditions had started to make errors, causing holes in their meticulously tended perimeter. Scout snuggled up against Emily's knee, its tiny body quivering with excitement instead of worry. The cub's actions validated Emily's growing suspicion that weren't confined to one cabin. Rather, they were waiting and taking part in a far larger scheme. more advanced than anything that could be created by human technology, as dawn approached Emily as she finished getting ready. The onlookers outside believed they were recording a straightforward biological occurrence, but they were about to see something much more significant. Evidence of nature's capacity to defend itself, adapt, and endure in methods that went against human expectations and managed to bring the storm to its height. Inside, a crescendo produces a natural symphony of swirling snow and howling winds. Emily stared from the cabin as her meticulously planned strategy started to come to fruition. Despite the fact that labor had reached a crucial stage, the Lynx moved with an almost supernatural poise. The observers outside had coordinated with something that was beyond human comprehension, started to act less professionally, and their costly, storm-damaged equipment was breaking down. The strong lights gradually dimmed and flickered, casting whirling shadows that hid the expanding light. A voice shouted out as a number of forms moved through the darkness outside their perimeter, the apparatus freezing up. "Professor Matthews, we're losing our ability to record video." Their words were filled with frustration as their well-planned documents fell apart in the face of Emily discreetly made her way through the cabin, positioning herself to take advantage of nature's sheer strength. Scout observed her movements and the behavior of the little cubs close to the damaged glass. Reflecting an insight well beyond its years, she was able to perceive through the cracks in the temporary barrier what the observers were unable to see: the dozens of eyes gleaming in the darkness, getting closer every second. Emily Matthews said, "This is madness." His calm finally broke. "Consider the scientific contributions before jeopardizing years of possible research." Even though his words were almost lost in the wind, Emily could hear their urgent tone. Aurora gave a quiet hum. Emily heard what sounded almost like a purr, and the Lynx gaze locked with hers, delivering a message that cut across the boundaries of species. The cubs included SC. Their tiny bodies tightened as they had positioned themselves strategically around their mother. Expectation, a succession of jagged fissures from whence the first indication that their circumstances had drastically changed. The edge of the woodland. The tripod mount cameras of the observers started collapsing one by one as shadowy forms zipped between them. Their apparatus overlooked the delicate coordination of these mishaps. "Something is happening," one of the crew members yelled. "Panic edging!" The strong spotlight swung wildly into his speech, attempting to capture glimmers of movement that appeared to originate simultaneously from all directions. However, the lights were intended for documentation purposes rather than. It simply made it possible for nature's agents to use Emily's deeper shadows. Her heart grew with comprehension upon realizing that Aurora had not merely sought out her cabin for refuge, she had guided her assailants into a nature's own trap, creating the complicated. Emily's research into social networks revealed that they were significantly more advanced than she had previously thought. Imagined through the fury of the storm, new sounds started to appear, such as faint growls, the rustle of movement through the underbrush, the gentle pad of pores in the snow. The weather-weakened observers' perimeter started to crumble as their focus, with the equipment dispersed in various ways. Matthews yelled as another victibeur. His priorities persisted when the camera fell to the ground, securing the documentation. Evident that despite the pandemonium that surrounded him, his scientific drive was blind to the larger powers at play. Aurora's respiration abruptly shifted, becoming more. With practiced inadequacy, Emily was aware that the time they had been anticipating had finally come. Started carrying out their plan's final phase, with the cubs reacting to various. Scout pushed against Emily's leg as they approached their mother in an unspoken indication. For the last time, its tiny face approached hers with a nearly human expression. With faith and resolve, Emily realized at that very instant her part in this drama was not as a scientist recording the mysteries of nature, but as a protector assisting in shield them when the storm reached its zenith and the wind began to roar with nearly supernatural force. The last of the observers' lights died and flickered, bringing the setting to a state of natural darkness, as Emily heard Matthew's voice rising in annoyance and perplexity. "Where are they?" "I see nothing but—" The shapes moving showed Emily that her years in the bush had taught her to trust more than just her eyes. She recognized the gathering of nature's forces through the darkness. Captivated by innate instincts and ties that human science was just starting to recognize, that Aurora's relatives had traveled not only to see the birth but also to make sure its defense against those who would take advantage of it, the cabin's exterior darkness had completely collapsed, only to be broken by the observer's intermittent flashing emergency lights inside. Emily worked with precision, coordinating her moves with Aurora's more deliberate breathing. Through the smashed glass came the moment they had been waiting for. The chaos's sounds intensified, and the observers took care to— Professor Matthews's equipment was dispersed and rendered unusable, and their professional operation was dissolving into disarray. Voice carried by the wind, frantically attempting to keep things under control. "Regroup and restore those lights," he yelled. But a new sound overpowered his orders, a chorus of hackers. The forest itself appeared to be in the dark, with gentle growls coming from it, reacting to guardians that appear when Aurora appears, that no scientific study that could have foreseen Emily's years of research all of a sudden came together. She captured the intricate social behaviors and patterns with crystal clarity. Her characterizations of her clients closed the circle that her co-workers had written off as chance. They were all a part of something much bigger. Intelligent Aurora hadn't simply taken refuge at Emily's cottage. She'd lead her assailants into the center of the domain of her extended family. Scout, the tiniest cub, positioned itself close to the window, its tiny body attentive yet unflinching. The other cubs naturally gathered near their mother to play a part in what was going to happen in Aurora's. Her strong body had become extremely focused on breathing as it prepared for not only delivery, but also a concerted effort that exceeded the capacity of human comprehension. Outside the observer's perimeter continued to collapse. Emily could hear their bewilderment and mounting panic as shadows deliberately navigated their camp. Tents collapsed, equipment fell to the ground, and the man-made barriers they had set up fell apart in the— Emily Matthews' voice carried a touch of the coordinated response of nature. Desperation. "But you don't realize what you're doing. This documentation has the potential to transform our comprehension of the behavior of wild cats." Yet his statements simply served to affirm that he was the person who failed to recognize that he was seeing something much more revolutionary than. And, according to any recorded observations, Aurora made a quiet noise that sounded nearly like a purr. A purr to connect with the air surrounding them, and the reaction was prompt. As they approached the cabin, Emily saw glimpses of strong figures moving through the darkness with newfound purpose. Beings with bright eyes and deliberate motions that conveyed intelligence far beyond the tiniest. The tiniest Cub Scout abruptly stood to attention, going beyond simple instinct. Emily looked out the window, ears forward, and saw what had— the observer's final glimmer of light had briefly attracted its attention. A sight of the many Lynx they were confronting, their winter coats shining in the fleeting light, had— these animals that surrounding the home weren't only untamed creatures, they were Aurora's large family, bonded by ties that human science was just starting to understand. "My God," she heard Matthews gasp as he at last noticed what was taking place. "This is not feasible because of established social structures." His scientific confidence disintegrated due to this type of coordination when confronted with facts that questioned. Emily moved quickly, confirming all he believed to be true about these creatures. Putting their plan's final phase into action, while lacking practice, collected her necessities and set her shop close to Aurora. No research paper could ever adequately convey the intelligence with which the Lynx's amber eyes greeted hers. They were no partners in something exceptional, and the storm's fury had gone beyond being only an observer and subject. At its height, the wind was screaming through the mayhem with a force that seemed almost supernatural. Emily heard the observers' voices rise in bewilderment and amazement as the last of their equipment failed. Scout rubbed against Emily's body in a manner that was beyond the explanation or control of scientific evidence. Leg one last time, its tiny body quivering with excitement instead of a new sound. a chorus of shouts that appeared to rise above the storm's ferocity. Aurora's quiet growl reverberated through the darkness around the cottage. Of her own, a signal that initiated their amazing drama's final act. Their last light flickered and faded, and the observer speaks to Rose in shock. Emily was able to see her eyes for a long time, despite the situation being plunged into natural darkness. Adjusted to the wilderness darkness, and what she saw there would alter her perspective on the animals that she had studied throughout her life as an example of how nature can defend its own. Rejected human authority and expectations, dawn emerged from the mountain with an almost supernatural calm, the storm having vanished so abruptly. When I got there, the area surrounding Emily's cottage had entirely changed. There was now simply pure snow where there had been mayhem and artificial lights, deep quiet. The costly equipment of the observers was buried and strewn around. Their meticulous documentation plans became meaningless amid new snow. Inside the cabin where Aurora slept, there was more than frozen metal and damaged cameras. Her new cubs were safely cuddled by her side, and the birth had been flawless in its inherent simplicity, unadulterated by scientific documentation or artificial observation. Throughout their tiny bodies, siblings had kept a watchful guard, offering warmth and consolation to their Emily. Briefly sat close to her journal as her mother was, in delivery, was her Richard carrier, and Emily, forgotten as she took in the enormity of what had happened. The night had shown her something that was far more than support of her initial hypotheses on Lynx social behavior. She had observed not only cooperation, but also a degree of concerted defense that, if she decided to, would transform knowledge of these amazing animals. Emily, please share it. Professor Matthew's voice sounded softly from outside, removing any evidence of. His tone has lost authority and we're getting ready to depart the Forest Service. They have provided some information on this area and its significance to the locals. The hesitancy in his voice indicated that he was still having trouble processing what he had. Emily saw the last spectators packing up via her window. Any tools they could save, and they moved quickly, almost anxiously, as if they realized at last that they were the intruders and the surrounding forest had gone back to its natural form. But they could now perceive what they had been missing before. To the vigilant presence of Scout, the extended family of Aurora is still defending the boundaries of their domain. Approached the window, its petite frame exuding a newfound sense of self-assurance. Cub has shown itself to be an essential link between two worlds in Emily's age. Through Scout's eyes, she was able to comprehend the extent of Aurora's faith in her, beyond the realm of scientific observation to something much deeper, the raw. The sound of cars starting up carried the unadulterated spirit of nature itself. Emily saw as the observer convoy started their retreat into the clear morning air. Their ambitious abandoned the documentation project due to uncontrollable forces or understand that Professor Matthews stood in the snow for a short time as, if he wanted to elaborate on your initial investigation, he eventually raised his voice, displaying a mixture of sadness and appreciation for Lynx's intricate social behaviors populations. We need to have paid closer attention to what he said. He turned and pursued his group as they left Emily's sanctuary to return to its natural tranquility, drawing in Aurora's gentle purr and Emily's demise. There was a depth of understanding in the lynx's amber eyes that no research paper could ever adequately explain, that she had selected Emily's cabin as a place of safety for giving birth, but also as a stronghold from which to plan a breathtaking display of nature's capacity to defend its own. Moving Emily started recording the events in her journal in private, but with a new viewpoint that she had learned to notice and document from her scientific background. But the events of the night had taught her something even more valuable, the value of understanding when to safeguard nature's secrets. Instead of subjecting them to abuse, the new cubs Little and Scout and its brothers squirmed perfectly against their mother's warm fur, formed a protective huddle around them, enclosing their tiny bodies in a live wall of affection and protection. The scene embodied everything Emily had sought out when she abandoned academia to discover the unvarnished, unadulterated truth of civilization. Unfortuitously, the unscientific aspirations of scientists, unbroken by discrimination laws, unafraid of expulsion, unspoiled at state. All proof of the turmoil from the night before. But something had essentially altered. The observers had arrived in order to record a rare biological occurrence. However, they had actually seen a manifestation of something much deeper, the innate knowledge and strength of nature to safeguard its own secrets. Emily's cottage outpost, which started out as a straightforward research project, has grown into something far bigger today as evidence of the strong ties that may develop across species when protection takes precedence over exploitation. Trust takes its place. Documentation. The night had validated Emily's long-held suspicion that occasionally the most significant scientific findings were too significant to preserve findings than publishing them in the spring. Arrived slowly in the Rocky Mountains, erasing the final remnants of that zenith welcome to her life despite the unusual winter, Emily's cabin had resumed its peaceful routine. Her life had completely changed. Her days of conducting lonely research had been replaced by the important lessons discovered throughout those demanding weeks spent with Aurora and her. One clear morning, Emily stood on her porch with her family and thought about how different. Her knowledge of nature had evolved into her old journal entries, which were full of theoretical frameworks and scientific observations, now appeared quite unsophisticated. In contrast to the profound wisdom she had personally experienced, Aurora and her family had demonstrated to her that their nature's elements that disregarded clinical documenting secrets that are worthy of protection rather than publishing. Confessor Matthews had tried to get in touch with her multiple times via official avenues that provide co-authorship on articles concerning Lynx social conduct. Emily had always said no, understanding that some facts were better left in their original state rather than being examined in scholarly journals. Yet the true legacy of those winter weeks was not found in any research papers or documentation. Scout continued in the prosperous Lynn family that now called these mountains home. In keeping with its spirit of adventure, the little cub nevertheless made infrequent visits, developed into a self-assured young lynx, yet it maintained the unique bond it had made with Emily during those pivotal days. These days, whenever it appeared, there was always news about Aurora's new cubs and their expanded family. Expanding the intricate social network while steadfastly defending their domain, Emily's research proceeded, but her new journal entries took a radically different tack and concentrated on comprehending. Instead of recording, safeguarding, and publishing, she had discovered, academic articles and scientific research were not the primary focus of wildlife conservation. Fundamentally, it was about preserving the fragile equilibrium that permitted nature's success. The events of that winter enlightened the Forest Service, allowing mysteries to develop undisturbed. Had discreetly declared the region a protected habitat, there had been no public notifications, brought up Lynx's remarkable social behavior, but the rangers who watched the area always nodded. When their paths crossed, they were considerate of Emily and realized that it was better to keep certain parts of nature undocumented, safeguarded by trust and silence than by academic documents. One morning, Emily completed her last entry while dawn painted the mountains in pink and gold hues. Regarding those extraordinary occurrences, the real test of scientific comprehension lies in what we decide to safeguard rather than what we can record and explain, which may be much better painted than anything. For, rather than record and explain and protect, Aurora's gift was more than just faith. It was a window into the deep knowledge of nature's own methods for safeguarding its priceless secrets. As she written these lines, a sound she recognized drew her gaze to the window. Scout and its own cubs were standing in the early morning light, exposing a new generation to. Emily grinned, realizing that the person who had gained their family's trust, her legacy will endure not in scholarly publications or research papers, but rather in the sustained prosperity of these amazing beings who had decided to share the mountains with her, had shown her that the most important discoveries frequently originate not from record and observation, but rather from gaining the confidence of the untamed spirits who reside on these peaks. By deciding to rather than reveal their secrets, Emily had discovered a more profound truth regarding, as the sun rose in the morning, conservation and the delicate balance between human curiosity and nature's right to privacy were discussed. Watching Scout and its family from above, Emily bathed the landscape in golden light, vanish into the woodland, serving as a reminder that certain tales are better kept secret. The real force of nature rests in mysteries that are best left unsolved. Not in what we can research and record, but rather in what we decide to safeguard and conserve for future generations. We sincerely hope that Emily's journey has warmed your hearts and helped you understand the deep mysteries of nature. The anecdote serves as a reminder that sometimes the best discoveries are not made by observation and documentation, but from gaining the confidence of the untamed spirits in our immediate vicinity. Much as we welcome you to discover the secrets of nature that Emily chose to preserve rather than reveal. Come together with us as we honor and preserve these priceless mysteries for future fascinating tales that examine the precarious equilibrium between people and wildlife. We've put together a special soundtrack you'll understand. If Emily's story has touched you, please click the link on the left of this video. Give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so we can continue to provide you with daily content, original tales that honor the intricacy and splendor of nature's surroundings. Leave your comments in the... What would you have done if you were Emily? How has this narrative turned out? Altered your viewpoint on wildlife conservation? Become a member of our community of naturalists and assist us in spreading remember. Like Emily, that everyone has a part to play in spreading these crucial lessons of conservation and reverence for the environment. To contribute to preserving nature's secrets, keep tuned for more amazing stories. It will test your knowledge and move you. Together, we can change the way the wild is preserved, spirits that coexist with us.